familiar face and friend.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I first wanted to thank all the speakers, Dr. Nasser, and all the speakers, Dr. Fakfuri, Dr. Nair, and also Dr. Dagli for their wonderful lectures and their talks. I will attempt to ask each speaker something I already asked Dr. Nasser. So I'll start with Dr. Fakfuri. You mentioned something very profound that caught my insight, about the possibility of wilaya or spiritual authority to being found in all the religions or in each prophetic founder of each revelation. That was a profound notion because we, often as Muslims, we confine spiritual authority or wilaya specifically within the Muhammadan form, and more particularly for those who are Shia to within, the Ahl al-Bayt or the Imamat. Can you speak more about how Muslims understood wilaya, or rather its expression in other religions? Did you understand the question, Dr. Fakfuri?
I think I did. As far as Muslim understanding of wilaya within Islamic tradition, I think it's obvious, and your question is not on that. Am I correct?
Yes, Dr. Fakfuri.
What I meant was that within every tradition there is a mystical dimension, and mystical dimension of each tradition represents the concept of wilaya within that tradition. That is what I meant.
All right.
Is it clear?
Yes. So in regards to any evidence or examples from the tradition itself, were there any authorities who expressed this particular notion or mentioned it in their writings? And would this be kind of interesting for food for thought and for research purposes?
I'm not an expert on Christianity or Judaism, but when Christ says I am the Alpha and Omega, he's talking about everything that we are discussing here. But on Judaism and other traditions, it's out of my expertise.
Dr. Awan, would you like me to add a few words to this? I think you were not happy with
Yes, please. No.
walking away
Yes,
with a sad face.
Yes, Doctor. Well, I'm always happy in front of you, Dr. Nasser.
The Islamic understanding of walaya from the point of view of walaya is the following. Every revelation that God sends to a prophet contains both an aspect of nubuwwah and an aspect of walaya. There are two powers that are given by God to a prophet. The power which of legislation, of running society, of creating laws, which has to do with nubuwwah, and an esoteric initiatic power, which is called walaya. And those people have developed this doctrine in Islam, which is very elaborate, very, very elaborate. They discussed it in Arabic, and before that in Tirmidhi and others, in Khurasani Sufis of the 3rd and 4th century, going back to the origin of Islam and the use of the word walaya, have developed the following idea. You first of all have, with every prophet, his complement. Moses represented nubuwwah, Aaron represented walaya. On the level of creating a religion, Christ represented nubuwwah. John, they say Yahya, well, this is Yahya, probably the author of the Gospel of John, not Yahya, John the Baptist. The debate in Islamic sources about this represents walaya. In the case of Islam, the prophet that represents nubuwwah, Ali that represents walaya. But the function of walaya is already inside the being of the founder of the religion. But the two functions become distinguished from each other as that tradition unfolds. Now, from this is developed a very complicated sacred history that is really very difficult to discuss right now because it needs a lot of background. But the important thing to take away with us is that for those who speak about wilaya, not in the sense of rule, political rule and things like that, or Walayat Faqih wa Ayatollah Khomeini, not in that sense, in the sense of spiritual wilaya, fact, what happened in Iran with the Ayatollah Khomeini converted spiritual walaya into political walaya. I'm not talking about political walaya, I'm talking about spiritual walaya. This, which leads to the question of initiation, of transmission of a spiritual influence, and of the continuity of a spiritual influence independent of the Sharia and the divine law and external laws of a religion within that religion, which make part of that continuity. You could even say the Shankaracharyas in India represent the continuation of Walaya in Hinduism, from the great Shankaracharya to those who live in India today. So there is also continuity of a spiritual power. That, the important to understand that from the point of view of Sufi or esoteric doctrine, that is something which has a divine origin. It comes from God. It's there with the Prophet himself, and you can discuss the whole of Islamic history on the basis of how each group looked at the relationship between Walaya and Nubuwwah, between prophecy and this initiatic power. All the way from the Ismailis, who considered Walaya to be more important, to the Wahhabis, who do not even accept Walaya, to Orthodox Sunni Sufis and Shiites who try to create a balance between the two, I mean, to Ethna-Ashari Shiism. So this is a very, very important doctrine. As long as we understand that its origin from the Islamic tradition, the divine power given by God to make possible an esoteric and inner journey into the inner being of the human being and back to God. That's all we have to know. The rest has very, very multifarious historical unfoldings. I'm sorry, according to your question.
So couldn't we say that in Christianity, Christ, because did not introduce any set of laws, he himself is the embodiment of Walaya himself?
You could say that from the point of the Abrahamic religions. Abrahamic religions, Friedrich Schwann has already written about this, that you have a kind of a Trinitarian manifestation of monotheism. Moses represents the law. Christ represents the way or Walaya. And Islam, or the Prophet, represents the balance of the two. This has been very well explained in the Transcendent Unity of Religions of Friedrich Schwann. You cannot take the thunder out of his words. Right? He is he who first very beautifully expounded this.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy now. Thank you.
The next question. Can you please address to which speaker you're addressing your question?
I would like as many people to comment on this as possible. First of all, thank you for 4 great presentations. I wanted to you to comment on a verse from the Quran that. I wanted you to comment on a verse from the Quran from Surah Ma'idah.
No, it's all right. We can hear you.
If you could comment on a verse from the Quran from Surah Ma'idah, verse 48, where, I'll read it from the study Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that for each of you we have appointed a law and a way. And had Allah willed, He would have made you one community, but He willed otherwise, that He may try you in that which He has given you. So vie with one another in good deeds. Unto Allah shall be your return altogether, and He will inform you of that therein you differ. I was wondering if you could comment on that particular verse and how the people that don't have, to me, this is a very perennialist ayah, and it's basically telling me that Allah is in control of willing different law on different people, and it's God's will. So if you could please comment on that and how people counter that verse.
Oh, I'll just say 2 words. I think Dr. Duggley will also like to say a few words that maybe you will say a few words. The 2 words that are used in this verse are the Ma'da, Shar'atan wa minhajan. And Shar'a is related to the root of Sharia, which means law, religious law. And this is one of the 2 or 3 clearest verses of the Quran that God himself has willed the multiplicity of religions. And if he had willed, there would be only one religion, it says very clearly. But God didn't want to have many religions. Why? So you can vie with each other. One of the very important elements in the presence of various religions in the old days was that members were taught by the members of the other side oftentimes what they were lacking. I will tell you a story. In the First World War, the Russians, at that time Tsarist Russia, before Lenin came to power, occupied northern Iran. And they took over the city of Qazvin, which is 150 kilometers north of Tehran. This story was told to me by my great teacher, Asad Hasan Rafi'i Qazvini, one of the greatest philosophers and theologians and lawyers of the 20th century. Incredible man. He was a young man. He said, these Russian soldiers would get up every morning. It was a very snowy city, very cold city, and would go to Mass at 6 o'clock every morning. And one Friday, in the Friday mosque of Qazvin, before 1,000 Muslims, a great alim got up and said, look, we live in Qazvin. Why don't we learn from these Russians who get up every morning at 6 o'clock to say the Mass, to get up and say our morning prayers? This way that religions, in a sense, influence each other in this way. As a child in Iran, we had Christians and Jews, especially Armenians, a lot around there. But this interaction of this kind, this goes back to the verse of the Quran. This goes back to God wanted to have different religions. I mean, there's certain people, let's say on some island in New Guinea, there might be only one religion but that's an exception. Always you had different religions. So could be this diversity, this multiplicity of ways to God. And so the Quran uses the plural, shar'atan wa minhajan, that there's only one path. If we had wanted, we would create only one religion. This is the strongest, one of the two verses I think in the Quran, strongest argument against exclusivism based on the Quran. I think this is one of the most important verses. Would you like to add something?
The only thing that I would add is that the refrain that comes at the end of that ayah, which is not only in that verse but also several places in the Quran, is this reminder that knowledge of the full implications of religious differences, as is how I read it, is impossible essentially for almost everyone. That Muslims are commanded in a sense to leave aside at one level the incomprehensibilities, the things that they don't understand about the differences between religions and why they're different. And they're told to leave it in God's hands, and He will inform you later concerning that wherein we differed. Now, what you find very often completely missing in a lot of the discourse about, especially amongst the exclusivists, they seem to have a complete and utter certainty about every single last dimension of difference and conflict between religious doctrines. They're able to identify every single last thing that's wrong with another religion, which doesn't leave any room for God to then tell them something more about those differences. So there's something wrong. And so it fits in general with the Islamic, or the overall Islamic view. I mean, there's a lot of things I didn't get to in my talk, but it also fits in with the general Islamic view, the spirit, you might say, that Muslims are not really, despite what some people say today with this kind of modern, almost evangelical form of Islam that's been developing, most Muslims are not really responsible for the souls of other people in the way that a modern evangelical Christian would think. We are really called upon to leave other people's souls and their divine destiny in God's hands in a positive way. And there's many different ways in which the Quran speaks about this. And so from one point of view, it allows a Muslim soul to have a little bit of tranquility and sanity when it comes to the array of religious variety, and it allows them just to focus on their own relationship with God and not worry about figuring it all out, because that's impossible for most people. And even for people who have that talent, it takes a lifetime to even make any progress.
But there's also other verses in the Quran. The most famous one that comes to my mind now is in Surah Baqarah, that God talked about إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَالْأُنثَىٰ وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلًا لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you would get to know each other. But there's also a criteria in there. إِنَّا أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِندَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. The most loved before God of you is the most pious of you. And therefore, this is also another evidence for multiplicity of religion being accepted by God. Indeed.
And I just wanted to add that one of the critiques of the perennialist reading of this verse is to say, no, that will of God, that God willed it to be so, is not the moral imperative, but it's just an ontological imperative. It's in the same way that God creates the action of a murderer, God has willed that this should be the case, not that he's endorsing it. But which, of course, if you read the whole verse, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever to read it that way. But that's one of the objections. That's the kind of, you might say, the hook that's used to also deny the plain sense of that verse.
Just
Thank you.
small, I mean, John, the vie with one another in good deeds, I'm assuming the word is hasanat there, do you know?
No, istabiqul khayrat fil khayrat.
Khairat, oh.
Yeah.
Well, never mind then. I was going to try to bring it back to Hassan, but not there.
I think it's khayrat.
So my question is for Dr. Faghfouri and anyone else, any others who want to comment on it. But you were explaining the early history of Sufism, or precursors to Sufism. And I believe, if I understood, you said it was a group of the companions of the Prophet who gathered around Ali and Abu Bakr. But I understood that there was a group that had gathered around the Prophet himself and were initiated at some point on his first attempt at visiting Mecca after he moved to Medina. And I also recall the story about one of his companions who was coming out of the Prophet's house in Medina and was asked by a friend, "What do you guys talk about in these private meetings?" And he said, "If I told you, you would stone me." So didn't the Prophet himself, didn't he have a group of people that you could call Sufis?
Well, actually, he did initiate himself the early companions like Salman Farsi and Ali and a few others. But what the sentence that you are referring to is a very famous hadith that apparently the Prophet spoke in accordance to the capacity of each and every one of these individuals. What you said is actually, in full quotation, is that which I had told Salman, if I had told Abu Dhar would have killed Salman. Is that what you are referring to? Perhaps, right. And that shows that spiritual reality, spiritual teaching also has hierarchy until that preparedness in the soul is there so that the person who receives that can absorb that. There is also a similar hadith attributed to Imam Sadiq, who said to one of his companions that what I'm telling you, if you tell others, they would actually stone me to death. But that is probably what you are saying.
The next question, thank you.
Hello, assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for all the talks today. I had a question, general one. I think maybe dotted amongst some of the speakers today, there's some people touched upon the notion of like the feminine and feminine spirituality and how that's been a very common feature throughout Muslim spiritual history. Especially in Dr. Faghfouri's talk earlier, he mentioned but then I'm also thinking about the masculine, right? And you mentioned the fatwa orders in your talk. I mean, it struck me that there's a sense in which there's this real idea of the masculine and the masculine's own kind of notion of spirituality having to do with values of honor and dignity, charity, ghaira, I mean, other sorts of values. And I've recently been contemplating a lot about what many have called this crisis of masculinity amongst Muslims today, or just people of spirituality in general. And many of these values that I just mentioned come off as outdated or anachronistic, like we're about to start duels with one another or something like this, you know? But at the same time, I think there's still value in that. I mean, I guess this is general, asking for your comments on this notion about how can we talk today about such values that maybe traditionally have been tied to the notion of the masculine, in that kind of context, and whether that, I don't know if my question makes sense, but anything.
No.
What I refer to as feminine feminine possibility of wilaya, initiation, and spiritual authority, I gave the example of Sayyidatuna Fatima. But there were many other very prominent women who participated, in fact, in spiritual life. And some of the early Sufi masters, in fact, very clearly stated that there is no distinction between men and women in terms of spiritual life. There is a saying that the real men on the path are actually women. But also, there is a saying attributed to Bayezid Bastami, saying that those who have gathered here, alluding to his Sufi center, to his Khanaqah, saying that these are so immersed in the remembrance of the friend that womanness and manness are set aside and forgotten. They are all after understanding Tawheed. If they are all understanding Tawheed, and the fact that they are trying to, that means they can, men and women equally understand Tawheed, there shouldn't be any distinction. And there is no distinction. If there were any restriction for women participation in Sufi centers as frequently as men, they were products of social restrictions, social issues, culture of the region or wherever. But there is no impossibility of female participation in any of these undertakings that Sufi men, in fact, did undertake. And did I answer your question, or?
Yeah. I didn't really have a specific ask per se. I just wanted your comments on just the notion of the masculine spirituality, whether there were any particularities there that, or things that we might want to think about in our modern context. But thank you.
And Quran itself also, when addressing men and women, uses both terms, both genders. Quran addresses al-mu'mineen wal-mu'minat, al-abideen wal-abidat, al-sadiqeen wal-sadiqat. These are all masculine and feminine forms of addressing. And therefore, the fact that they are being addressed shows that every possibility that is open to men, by the same reason, are open to women as well.
I might also add just a couple of remarks, which is to say that in general, in the intellectual social environment we're in, when these ideas about feminism or feminist, masculine, manly, these kind of words that come up, I think what happens is Muslims often just kind of get swept away in the current, and these essentially become varieties of identity politics of one sort or another, and we're trying to, rather than move towards some kind of spiritual goal or spiritual transformation, trying to fit into some kind of preconceived category that's given to us by the environment. And that's not going to go anywhere. If there's a, I think you alluded to this idea of the problem of boys in school, or the masculine, or the problem of men, and so these all have their root not in just social issues, not in just identity politics, but in metaphysics, right? What we think that we're supposed to do as a man is rooted in what we think is possible for a man, and what we think is possible is rooted in what reality is. And it's the cutting off of the sense of metaphysical reality, of the root of what a human being is, and what reality is, and what society is. That's what's the ultimate source of the problems. Otherwise, and then if you're just kind of juggling concepts like the masculine, the manly, social responsibilities, it tends to just go around in a loop that's determined by extrinsic factors instead of focusing on what the reality of what the self is, and then what you should be doing in regards to oneself. That, I think, is the root of the problem.
And on that plane, Quran addresses human beings most often, Ya ayyuhal insan, which includes both men and women, genderless. So to speak.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers.
Next question, thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, thank you all for your informative lectures. Given that tonight is the 15th night, I thought it might be a good, of Sha'ban, I thought it might be a good idea to ask the following question. And this is with regards to the Shiite belief regarding the existence of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. How is this to be understood from within the perennialist perspective? And how can this be reconciled with the Sunni perspective that the Mahdi has not yet appeared?
راجع به امام زمان میگه چطور چجوری میشه بین تشیع و تسنن به این موضوع برخورد کرد که
Let me summarize it for you very quickly. Both Sunnis and Shiites believe that there's a figure called the Mahdi. Based on hadith found in both Sunni and Shiite sources, repeated by the Prophet many times, both believe that at the end of time, a figure will come, will bear the name of the Prophet, his name will be Muhammad. And his title is the Mahdi, the Guided One. The difference between Sunni and Shiite point of view, I'm referring essentially to Ethna-Ashari Shiism, not Ismailism. The difference between the two is that the Ethna-Ashari Shiites believe they know who the Mahdi is. And the Sunnis believe that he has not been born, at least the majority of Sunnis. The Shiites believe that the 12th Imam, the son of Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam, disappeared as a young man in the city of Samarra in Iraq. And after a period called the minor occultation, al-Ghaybat al-Sughra, in which he spoke through 4 representatives, all of whom are buried in the area of Baghdad, in different areas, cemeteries in Baghdad. After that, this period also came to an end. And then the last spokesman of the Mahdi, he said, now the affairs are in the hands of God. And after that, there was no more spokesman of the Mahdi, and he went to what's called the major occultation, Ghabat al-Sughra, which lasted for 1,000 years, and in which the Shiites believe they're living now. And so there's been continuous expectation of the return of the Mahdi. And this is very, very similar to the Christian view of the expectation of the second coming of Christ. All Orthodox Christians throughout 2,000 years of history believe that Christ will come back. Not in a metaphorical way, but in an eschatological way, in a real historical way also. And the difference is that the Ashari Shiites, they believe that when the Mahdi comes, that does not in any way nullify the second coming of Christ. That these two events are related together. And most hadith said the Mahdi will come for 7 years or 70 years, that's a debate, to re-establish peace on earth, after which Christ will come. And some people say the Mahdi will kill the Dajjal, the Antichrist. Some people say no, Christ will kill. It's a very complicated eschatological matter. The important thing to understand is that since the persona, personality, the identification of the Mahdi in 12 Imam Shiism is known to everyone, it's been much more difficult in 12 Imam Shiism for someone to claim to be the Mahdi than in Sunni Islam, where throughout history, you've had various Mahdiist movements. In modern times, the most famous being that of the Sudan, the Mahdi of the Sudan, and the Barelvi family in the northwest provinces of India. But there are also others. Even Ghulam Ahmad, who founded the Ahmadiyya movement, in a sense had a Mahdiist claim, and many others. And just to tell when Ayatollah Khomeini came to Iran, you had that new Mahdi in Nigeria, which caused the death of 10,000 people in the 1970s. But you weren't born then, but some of the older people, Mr. Blake probably remembers some of the people in the room. So this is an important difference. So the historical appearance of the phenomenon of Mahdiism in Sunni Islam is very different from Shiite Islam. In Shiite Islam, after over 1,000 years, the only serious pretension to the Mahdi's movement is Baha'ism, where Sayyid Muhammad Bab, the founder of this movement, who was not a Baha'i, he was a Babi, he was a teacher of Baha'u'llah, claimed to be the Bab. The Bab was the title given to those 4 people who during that Ghaybat al-Sughra, the minor occultation of the Mahdi, spoke to the people in Baghdad. And so he said the Bab has now been opened again after 1,000 years, and I am the Bab. And the person who came through that door was a man called Baha'u'llah, who started a new religious movement, they call it Faith, a kind of modernist progress movement at the time of the British rule over much of Asia, and influenced a lot by modern Western ideas, but also drawing from Shiite background. And it came at exactly the same time as Mormonism in Utah. These two movements came with a 10-year period of each other. Very, very interesting. And there's Soka Gakkai, Brahma Samaj, other movements in India and Japan. But these are the two most important ones that come up in the 19th century. And it's the only time in 12 Imam Shiism in which someone has seriously claimed to be the Mahdi. To claim to be Imam Zaman is not an easy thing. Once in a while, some crazy person in Iran says that and they give him some medicine to take or put him in an insane asylum. But in the Sunni world, it's led to major political and military movements throughout history. Does that satisfy you?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Dagli, you want to say something?
No.
There are also a couple Shia hadiths saying that the second coming of Christ would coincide with the coming of the Mahdi. In fact, there are other Shia hadiths saying that Christ would hold the reins of the mule on which the Mahdi is sitting, the Mahdi is mounting. Whatever the reality may be, only God knows. But the point is that the Shia expectation in some ways correlate with what the Prophet said. And that is why we haven't had in the Shiite world any appearance of the Mahdi. The Prophet, when they asked when the time of the coming will be, he said only God knows. And anybody who claims to know is either a hypocrite or a charlatan.
You know, I would add just one perhaps area of contact on this question, which is that there is a very important similarity between the idea of the invisible hierarchy of awliya in Sunnism and the corresponding idea within Shiism. So in other words, the way in which the Mahdi and this kind of the invisible hierarchy, the invisible world of spiritual power and influence affecting the spiritual lives of people has a very strong correspondence within Sunni Islam. And it's not just at the fringes. I mean, it's right down into the center of Orthodox Sunni Islam that, in a sense, part of the spiritual economy of the world has to do with this hierarchy of the poles, the abdal, the substitutes, and so forth and so on. The men, the invisible men. And so that's another point of contact where there's quite a lot of similarity. It doesn't make them identical, but it's a very there's a lot of substantial similarity between them.
Thank you very
This
much.
is a bit tangential, but I can't resist throwing it in there. In the South Asian context, since we were talking about avatars in my talk earlier, there's the cycle of 10 avatars, divine descents of Vishnu. The 10th one theoretically hasn't happened yet. Kalki, the 10th avatar, is supposed to come at the end of times. Yes, that's right. And particularly Shia communities in South Asia readily plugged in the cycle of Imams, the waiting of the Mahdi. They identified him with Kalki. And there's this ready language of identifying this return of the light of Muhammad again and again with each Imam. And they'll sometimes even use the language of rebirth, of reincarnation, as this descent of the avatar. So we're waiting for the Mahdi, we're waiting for Kalki. You see, I've never done this systematically, but at the end of times, there's this horseman figure, there's a sword, there's often 4 figures. This number 4 gets repeated again and again across civilizations. It's something very much worth looking into
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I've been informed that we have time for just a couple more questions, so if you could be brief and swift. Thank you.
I'll be swift. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for organizing this at such a critical time in our history in North America. I had a question with 2 parts. Could you please comment on why a lot of, or perhaps all prophets gave glad tidings of the arrival of Ahmed? And secondly, how should Muslims understand the narration of the Isra wa Miraj in which the Prophet led all previous prophets in prayers?
چرا ادیان دیگه فکر کردن که احمد خواهد آمد و معنی ملاقات پیغمبر تو معراج پیغمبر دیگر رو معنیش چیه؟
Christ refers to the following. He says, after me, the Paraclete shall come. The word Paraclete is a Greek word, parakletos. And this was translated into Arabic as Faraglit, and then it was transformed a little bit and into a word whose meaning corresponds to the name Ahmad, which is the inner esoteric name of the Prophet. It is believed by almost all Muslims that Christ was referring to the coming of the Prophet of Islam after him. And surely a phenomenon as vast as this, which in fact took the whole Mediterranean world away, the southern Mediterranean world away from Christianity, and it spread more than Christianity itself, could it have been left completely in silence by spiritual figure as great as Christ? This is the question. Orientalists all reject this argument, except for Henri Corbin, who wrote a very, very important article on Le Paraclet in French, which I suggest if you read French to read. I don't know whether it's in English or not. I haven't seen it anyway. In which he takes the whole root of the word Paraclete from Greek, how they developed in the early church, what they thought it was. They thought it was sort of perhaps the Holy Ghost or something like that. How in fact in Arabic it's raised to the name Ahmad, which is the inner name of the Prophet. That is the meaning of the word Ahmad, not the form of it. And so there is such a thing. As to the vision of other prophets by the Prophet of Islam during the Mi'raj, it has a very profound significance for what Dr. Dagley was talking about today. It represents, in fact, the integration of the prophetic function into the final vision of the Prophet. The prayers that we perform every day, with Muslims. How did we learn it? We learned it when the Prophet came back from Mi'raj. Certain forms of the prayer were already taught in Mecca before the Mi'raj, but the Surah Al-Fatiha, but not the complete movement. A complete movement comes when the Prophet bowed with his forehead in sujood before the divine throne. And from that comes the sujood. Unfortunately, my knees don't work anymore. I have to sit down, but I've done for 60 years. And younger Muslims do. It's sujood that we do on the ground, and then sitting down, and then ruku', and standing up. All these movements are externalization of the spiritual experience of the Prophet during Mi'raj. Now, those experiences are all combined with the vision of the other prophets. So in a sense, every time we pray, something of the archetype of the other spiritual universes is integrated within the Islamic Muhammadan archetype within us. Within us. I quoted this verse this morning. I didn't quote the first part of it. It's a very, very significant verse. چون که 100 آمد 90 هم پیش ماست. اسم احمد اسم کل انبیاست. Once you have 100, you also have 90. The name of Ahmad is the name of all the prophets. So even in a ritual aspect, in a sense, the Salat integrates something of the spiritual prototype of the prophets who came before Islam, and therefore the vision of the other prophets during Mi'raj is not just an interesting fact. It's the integration of a whole universe into the supreme spiritual experience of the Prophet, the Mi'raj, which itself is the father or mother, progenitor of the daily prayers. That's why Salat is called As-Salat Mi'raj al-Mu'min. When we really pray, we should be going on Mi'raj. Subah, we don't pray well. But if we do well, Salat Mi'raj al-Mu'min. I'm sorry, Silifat, I took too much time, but this is for the last person.
Thank you.
He still wants to ask questions?
I might get in trouble, but I'll let one more
There's a
question
lady.
very quickly. I know.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is simple, and it's for all of the speakers, perhaps particularly for Dr. Nasr. It's, is there something wrong with thinking your religion is the best religion, or one's religion is the best? I mean, is there perhaps some sort of benefit to some degree of exclusivism?
چی گفت؟ میگه این درسته که هر کسی ادعا بکنه ریلیجن من دین من بهترین دینه. آیا این یه فرمی از اکسکلوسیویسم نیست؟
Yes, I'll answer very quickly. There's something absolute in religion, otherwise they wouldn't follow it. So for every person, his or her religion is the best religion. What we're saying is that this is true, but from the point of view of that person. It's like saying my wife is the most beautiful wife, a woman in the world. That doesn't mean there are not other beautiful women. So there is a kind of exclusivism that is associated with belonging to anything. The fact that we're in this room, we're not in the next room. That by very fact of the presence here, it excludes the there. So these two are not against each other. There is something, there must be a sense of the absolute in religion, otherwise we will not follow it. However, it is possible to understand that wonderful phrase that Frida Schwann added, that something as a relatively absolute, that is something which within a universe is absolute, but it's not the absolute. Only the absolute is absolute. And the best example of that is in astronomy. In our solar system, the sun is the absolute center. It plays an absolute role. But vis-a-vis all the other solar systems is one among many. The fact that the other solar systems does not diminish from the sun being the center of our solar system. So the sun is both absolute and relative. Now the only thing that is relative, absolute, is God himself. So in every religion, you have a manifestation which is relatively absolute. It's absolute within that particular universe. But it's not absolute in an ultimate metaphysical sense, because only God is absolute. As soon as creation takes place, relativity begins. As soon as you say, Alef, Lam, Mim, Dhalak, Al-Kitab, La Raiba Fi, the beginning of the Quran. As soon as you have Alef, you have excluded Ba. You're in the world of relativity. It's that silence that comes before the Aleph, that is the absolute. As soon as the silence is broken in manifestation, in the sacred word, you descend from the absolute into the relative. But it's a relativity which bears the absolute. That's the difference between Aleph, Lam, Mim, and the books that I write. That's right. You still quote after 1400 years Aleph, Lam, Mim. 10 years from now, nobody knows what I've written. That's because there's perfume of the absolute in it. But it itself is not absolute, otherwise the word does not have any meaning. As soon as you say Aleph, you don't say Ba. You're in the world of relativity. So it's a very, very important metaphysical question you ask. On the practical level, there must be always a sense of absoluteness in one's religion, otherwise one would not follow it. If this, I'm going from here home, I live in Bethesda. If I didn't go down Canal Road and didn't know that I was going to go home, there's something absolute in that. I would never get home. I would wander around in various streets. At the same time, it's not the only road. You can take Mass Avenue and cut to the left on Wisconsin. That's the way religion is, and you have to have both elements have awareness in you.
I'm afraid that's absolutely the last question. The speakers, some of them may be available afterwards. If you're able to catch them, you may be able to address your further questions to the speakers. We'll end this session and we'll start preparing for the concert with the Firdaus Ensemble. Thank you very much to all the speakers.